Okay, we're going to try this again. This is a book called The Invisible Rainbow, Chapter 10, called Porphyrins and the Basics of Life by author Firstenberg. This is Chapter 10. Today is the 12th day of September 2024. So I'm going to be reading this particular chapter. It's been a little while since I've done a broadcast. So let's get into the work here. Thank you for being here. I see little hope to be able to explain the subtle difference between a normal and a sick cell, that is a cell, ELL, as long as we do not understand the basic difference between a cat and a stone. This is from an Albert Gregorian quote. I find that's interesting simply because I've been researching how to actually heal myself by frequencies, you see, which this has a connection here. Strangely enough, porphyrin is not a household word. It is not a sugar, fat, or protein, nor is it a vitamin, mineral, or hormone, but it is more basic to life than any other of life's components, because without it, we would not be able to breathe. Plants could not grow. There would not be any oxygen in the atmosphere. Wherever energy is transformed, wherever electrons flow, they're looked for porphyrins. When electricity alters nerve conductions or interferes with the metabolism of our cells, porphyrins are centrally involved. As I write this chapter, a dear friend has just died. The last 7 years she had had to live without electricity, hardly ever seeing the sun. She seldom ventured out in the daylight or daytime. When she did, she covered herself from head to foot in thick leather clothing, a broad brim leather hat hiding her face, and glasses bearing 2 layers of dark lenses concealing her eyes. A former dancer who loved music, nature, and the outdoors, Bethany was virtually abandoned by a world in which she no longer belonged. Her condition, probably caused by her years of work for a computer company, was a classic example of an illness that has been known to medicine only since 1891. Its emergence at that time being one of the side effects of the sudden worldwide expansion of electrical technology. Its connection with electricity was discovered a century later, although it is now considered an extremely rare genetic disease, affecting as few as 1 person in 50,000. Porphyrin was originally thought to affect as many as 10% of the population. Its supposedly rarity is due in large part to the ostrich-like behavior of the medical profession after World War II. Okay, he's making it very clear that the medical profession is basically no eyes, no hair, no eyes, no hearing whatsoever. What's really going on in the real world? Okay, we have a real problem, folks, in the medical situation. We have a real big problem with them because they're in denial of a lot of things that are going on. There's a book that's actually I read long ago, Dead Doctors Don't Lie. What that means simply is very clearly that they die themselves of the same thing. They claim that they are healing other people. Or not, they don't use the word heal. They claim that they're actually helping people. In reality, they're not. That's the fact. Okay? In the late 1940s, medical practitioners were staring at an impossible contradiction. Most synthetic chemicals were known poisons, but one of the legacies of the war was the ability to manufacture products from petroleum easily and cheaply to substitute for almost every consumer product imaginable. Now, thanks to the fledgling petrochemical industry bringing us, quote, better living through chemistry, end quote, synthetic chemicals were going to be literally everywhere. We were going to be wearing them, sleeping on them, washing our clothes, our hair, our dishes, and our homes with them, bathing in them, insulating our houses with them, carpeting our floors with them, spraying our crops, our lawns, and our pets with them, preserving our food with them, coating our cookware with them, packing our groceries in them, moisturizing our skin with them, and perfuming our bodies with them. The medical profession has two choices. It could have attempted to study the health effects singly and in combination of the hundreds of thousands of new chemicals that were kaleidoscoping over our world, a virtual impossible task. The attempt itself would have put the profession on a collision course with the mushrooming petrochemical industry, threatening the banning of most new chemicals and the strangling of the economic boom of the next 2 decades. The other alternate was for the profession to bury its collective head in the sand and pretend that the world's population was not actually going to become poisoned. Environmental medicine was born as a medical specialty in 1951, founded by a gentleman named Dr. Theron, Theron, Randolph. It had to be created. The scale of the poisoning was too great to go completely ignored. The sheer numbers of sickened patients, abandoned by mainstream medicine, produced an urgent need for practitioners trained to recognize at least some of the efforts of the new chemicals and to treat the resulting diseases. But the specialty was ignored by the mainstream as though it didn't exist. Its practitioners ostracized by the AMA. When I attended medical school from 1978 to 1982, environmental medicine wasn't even on the curriculum. Of course not. Chemical sensitivity, the unfortunate name that has been given to the millions of poisoned patients, was never mentioned in school. Neither was porphyrin, arguably a more appropriate name. It still isn't mentioned, nor not even in medical schools in the United States. Heightened sensitivity to chemicals, we recall, was first described by New York physician George Miller Beard, B-E-A-R-D, who considered it a synonym of a new disease, or I should say symptom of a new disease. The initiative of electrification of society through telegram wires brought with it the constellation of health complaints known as urethania, two of which were a tendency to develop allergies and a drastically reduced tolerance for alcohol and drugs. By the late 1880s, insomnia began to become a problem. Another prominent symptom of urethania had become so rampant in Western civilization that the sale of sleeping pills and potions became big business, with new formulations coming on the market almost every year. Bromonines, para-aldehyde, chloral, and amide hydrate, urethane, hypnoid, somanol, cannabidiol, and other hypnotics flew off pharmacies' shelf to satisfy the frustrated urge to sleep, and the addiction that so often followed the long-term use of these drugs. In 1888, one more drug was added to the list, sulfonate, that's spelled S-U-L-F-O-N-A-L, was a sleeping medication that had a reputation for its prompt effect, its non-addictive nature, and its relative lack of side effects. There was just one problem, which only became widely known after 3 years of its popularity. It killed people. But its effects were quirky, unexpected. 9 people could take sulfonate, even in large doses and for a long time with no untoward effects. But the 10th person, sometimes after only a few or even one small dose, would become critically ill. He or she would typically be confused, so weak as to be unable to walk, constipated with pain in the abdomen, sometimes with a skin rash and reddish urine, often described as the color of port wine. The reaction were idiosyncratic, liable to affect almost any organ, and the patients were apt to die or heart failure without warning. Between 4 and 20% of the general population were reported to be subject to such side effects from taking this particular product, sulfonate, I should say. Get all excited here, folks. During the ensuing decades, the chemistry of this surprising disease was worked out. Porphyrins are light, Light, sensitive pigments that play pivotal roles in the economy of both plants and animals and in the ecology of planet Earth. In plants, a porphyrin bound to magnesium is the pigment called chlorophyll that makes plants green and is responsible for photosynthesis. In animals, it's almost identical molecule bound to iron is the pigment called heme, Heme, the essential part of hemoglobin that makes blood red and enables it to carry oxygen. It's also an essential part of myoglobin, the protein that makes muscles red and delivers oxygen from our blood to our muscle cells. Heme, Heme, again, is also the central component of cytochrome and cytochrome C and cytochrome oxidase enzyme that are contained in every cell of every plant, animal, and bacterium that transport electrons from nutrients to oxygen so that our cells can extract energy. And heme is the main component of the cytochrome P450 enzymes in our liver that detoxifies environmental chemicals for us by oxidizing them. In other words, porphyrins are the very special molecule that interface between oxygen and light. They're responsible for the creation, maintenance, and recycling of all of the oxygen in our atmosphere. They make possible the release of oxygen from carbon dioxide by plants, the extraction of oxygen back out of the air by both plants and animals, and the use of that oxygen by living things to burn carbohydrates, fats, and proteins for energy. So this is recycling of all the oxygen in our atmosphere that make possible the release of oxygen from carbon dioxide by plants. This used to be a major fact that we were taught long ago, but it seems that the public's forgotten their science back in the 1960s. The high reactivity of these molecules, which makes them transformers of energy, and their affinity for heavy metals also makes them toxic when they accumulate in excess in the body, as happens in a disease called porphyria, a disease that is not really a disease at all, but a genetic trait and born sensitivity to environmental pollution. Our cell manufacture heme from a series of other porphyrins and porphyrin precursors in a series of 8 steps, catalyzed by 8 different enzymes. Like workers on an assembly line, each enzyme has to work at the same rate as all the others in order to keep up with the demand for the final product called heme. A slowdown by any one enzyme creates a bottleneck, and the porphyrins and precursors that accumulate behind the bottleneck get deposited all over the body, which causes disease. Now, you know what disease means, folks. It simply means dis-ease. You're not at ease with yourself anymore. Or if the first enzyme is working harder than the rest, it produces precursors faster than the enzymes down the line can handle, with the same result. Their accumulation in the skin can cause mild to disfiguring skin lesions and mild to severe light, Light, sensitivity. Their accumulation in the nervous system causes neurological illnesses, and the accumulation in other organs causes corresponding illnesses. And when excess porphyrins spill into the urine, it takes on the color of port wine. Because porphyria is assumed to be so rare, it is almost always misdiagnosed as some other disease. It is fairly called the, quote, little imitator, end quote, because it can affect so many organs and mimic so many other conditions. Since patients usually feel so much sicker than they look, they are sometimes wrongly thought to have psychiatric disorders and too often wind up on mental wards. And since most people don't carefully examine their own urine, they usually fail to notice its reddish hue, particularly since the color may be evident only during severe disabling attacks. The enzymes of the heme pathway are among the most sensitive elements of the body to environmental toxics. Porphyria, therefore, is a response to environmental pollution and was indeed extremely rare in an unpolluted world. Except for one severe disfiguring congenital form of which can only a few hundred cases are known in the world. Porphyria enzyme deficiencies do not normally cause disease at all. So human beings are genetically diverse, and in times past, most people with relatively low levels of one or more porphyrin enzymes were simply more sensitive to their environment. In an unpolluted world, this was a survival advantage, allowing the possessors of this trait to easily avoid places and things that might do them harm. But in a world in which toxic chemicals are inescapable, the porphyrin pathway is to some degree always stressed, and only those with high enough enzyme levels tolerate the pollution well. Sensitivity has become a curse. Because of the way it was discovered and the lack of synthetic chemicals in the environment at that time, porphyria became known as a rare disease that was triggered in genetic susceptible people by certain drugs, such as safranon, which was to do with helping people sleep, or barbiturates, which these patients had to avoid. It was not until another century had passed in the early 1990s that Dr. William E. Morton, M-O-R-T-O-N, professor of occupational and environmental medicine at Oregon Health Science University, realized that because ordinary synthetic chemicals were far more widespread in the modern environment than pharmaceuticals, they had to be the most common triggers of porphyria attacks. Morton proposed that the controversial disease called multiple chemical sensitivity, which is simply called MCS, was in most cases identical with one or more forms of porphyria. And when he began testing his MCS patients, he found that indeed 90% of them were deficient in one or more porphyrin enzymes. He then investigated a number of their family trees, looking for the same trait, and succeeded in demonstrating a genetic basics for MCS, something no one had attempted before because MCS had never before been connected to a testable biological marker. And this is, folks, this was not that long ago. He discovered this, you see. This is the 1990s. Now, he doesn't give a general date like 95 or 98 or whatever, but it's in the 1990s. So this has only been 30 years ago, maybe less than 30 years ago, since it's 2024, you see. So Morton also found that most people with electrical sensitivity had porphyria enzyme deficiencies, and that electrical and chemical sensitivities appear to be manifestations of the same disease. Porphyria, Morgan showed, is not the extreme rare illness it is currently thought to be, but has to affect at least 5 to 10% of the world's population. Morton was courageous because the rare disease world of porphyria had come to be dominated by a handful of clinics who control virtually all research and scholarship in their small and bred field. They tended to diagnose porphyria only during acute attacks with severe neurological symptoms and to exclude cases of milder and smoldering illness. They generally would not make the diagnosis unless porphyria excretions in urine or stool was at least 5 to 10 times normal. Quote, "This makes no sense," end quote, wrote Morgan in 1995. So we're going to narrow it down to 1995. So we're saying 2025 would be next year, would be 30 years. Quote, and would be analogical to restricting the diagnosis of diabetes mellitus to those who have ketoacidosis, or restricting the diagnosis of coronary artery disease to those who have myocardial infarction. End quote. The higher numbers reported by Morton agree with the numbers reported over a century ago. The proportion of the population that became ill when they took the sleeping medication, safranon, they are consistent with the findings in the 1960s of MAUVE, M-A-U-V-E, factor, end quote. A lavender staining chemical not only in the urine of patients diagnosed with porphyria, but in the urine of 5 to 10% of the general population. MAUVE mark factor was eventually identified as a breakdown product of Porphyrin. That's the correct way of speaking. One of the porphyrin precursors. Morton also found an agreement with recent reports from England, the Netherlands, Germany, and Russia that persistent neurological problems occurred during the chronic smoldering phase of every type of porphyria, even those types which were previously supposed to cause only skin lesions. Hans Grunter, the German doctor who in 1911 gave porphyria its name, stated that, quote, such individuals are neuropathic and suffer from insomnia and nervous irritability, end quote. Does that remind you of anything, folks? What's going on behind us, around us already? Does anybody realize what's going on, why people cannot sleep anymore? And do you see the irritability of people also today? Morton has brought us back to the original view of porphyria. It is not only a fairly common disease, but exists most often in the chronic form with comparatively mild symptoms. And its principal cause is synthetic chemicals and electromagnetic fields that pollute our modern environment. Porphyrias are central to our story, not only because of a disease named porphyria, which affects a few percent of the population, but because of the part porphyrins play in the modern epidemics of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, which affect half the world. And because their very existence is a reminder of the role of electricity in life itself, a role which a few courageous scientists have also slowly elucidated. As a child, Albert Swintz Giorgio hated books and needed a tutor help to pass his exams. But later, having graduated from Budapest Medical School in 1917, he went on to become one of the world's greatest geniuses in the field of biochemistry. In 1929, he discovered vitamin C, and during the next few years, he worked out most of the steps in cellular respiration, a system now known as the Krebs, Krebs cycle. For these two discoveries, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1937. He then spent the next 2 decades figuring out how muscles function. After immigrating to the United States and settling at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, received the Albert Lasker Award of American Heart Association in 1954 for his work on muscles. But perhaps his greatest insight is one for which he is least known, although he's devoted almost half his life to the subject. That is, on March 12, 1941, in a lecture delivered in Budapest, he boldly stood up before his peers and suggested to them that the discipline of biochemistry was obsolete and should be brought into the 20th century. Living organisms, he told them, were not simply bags of water in which molecules floated like tiny billiard balls, forming chemical bonds with other billiard balls with which they happened to collide. Quantum theory, he said, and made such old ideas invalid. He's correct. Biologists needed to study solid-state physics. In his own specialty, although he had worked out the structure of the molecules involved in muscular contractions, he could not begin to fathom why they had these particular structures, nor how the molecules communicated with one another to coordinate their activities. He saw such unsolved problems everywhere he looked in biology. Quote, one of my difficulties within protein chemistry, end quote, he bluntly told his collegians, quote, was that I could not imagine how such a protein molecule can, quote, live. Even the most involved protein structure formula looks stupid, if I may say so, end quote. This phenomenon, that is the phenomenon that had forced St. Giorgio to face these questions for the porphyrin-based system of life. He pointed out that in plants, 2,500 chlorophyll molecules from a single functional unit, and that in dim light, at least 1,000 chlorophyll molecules had to cooperate simultaneously. In order to split one molecule of carbon dioxide carbon dioxide, and create one molecule of oxygen. Okay, so it takes 1,000 of these molecules in order to do split one molecule of carbon dioxide and create one molecule of oxygen. He spoke about the, quote, enzyme of oxidation, end quote, the cytochromes in our cells, and wondered again how the prevailing model could be correct. How could a whole series of large protein molecules be arranged geometrically so that electrons could wander directly from one to the other in a precisely sequence? Quote, even if we could devise such an arrangement, end quote. He said, quote, it would still be incomprehensible how the energy liberated by the passing of an electron from one substance to the other, viz. From one iron atom to the other, could do anything useful, end quote. St. Georgia proposed that organisms are alive because thousands of molecules from single systems with shared energy levels, such as physicians were describing in crystals. Electrons don't have to pass directly from one molecule to another, he said. Instead of being attached to only one or two atoms, electrons are mobile, belong to the whole system, and transmit energy and information over long distances. I should say not long, over large distances. In other words, the stuff of life is not billiard balls, but liquid crystals and semiconductors. St. Giorgio's sin was not that he was incorrect. He wasn't. It was his failure to respect the old animosity. Electricity and life were long divorced. The Industrial Revolution had been running full board for a century and a half. Millions of miles of electric wires clothe the earth, that is, exhaling electric fields that permeate all living things. Thousands of radio stations blanket the very air with electromagnetic oscillation that one could not avoid, and muscles were not allowed to be influenced by them. Proteins were not permitted to be semiconductors. The threat to industry, economies, and modern culture would be too great. So biochemists continue to think of proteins, lipids, and DNA as though they were little marbles drifting in a watery solution, colliding with one another at random. You see, the whole idea here, if you can just look at this whole idea, the randomness would tell you something's wrong. That's logical. Nothing doesn't happen by random coincidence, folks. There's a reason behind it. Well, they chunk God. You see, they chunk God out of the whole thing. And I'm not talking about the whole Christian perspective. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about simply is that God has a whole, everything that he involved in is always for purpose. It's not random. Okay? This is why they stumble in the dark. Okay? Most people just simply don't even, like I said, the St. George was basically, you happen to be someone who had some guts and said something. Most people don't do that because they're too involved with, quote unquote, making money. That's the huge problem. Or they're just too blind to see that they've been brainwashed. So biochemists continue to think of proteins, lipids, and DNA as though they were little marbles stripping. Okay, they even thought of the nervous system that way too. When forced to, they omitted parts of quantum theory, but only on a limited basis. Biological molecules were still only permitted to interact with their immediate neighbors, not to act at a distance. It was okay to acknowledge modern physics only that much, like opening a small hole in a dam for knowledge to leak through one drop at a time. While the main structure is reinforced less, a flood demolishes it. Old knowledge about chemical bonds and enzymes in a water solution must now coexist with new models of electron transport chains. It was necessary to invent these to explain phenomena that were most central to life, photosynthesis and respiration. Large porphyrin containing protein molecules no longer had to move and physically interact with one another in order for anything useful to happen. These molecules could stay put and electrons could shudder between them instead. Biochemistry was becoming that much more alive, but it still had a long way to go. For even in the new models, electrons were constrained to move only like little messenger boys between one protein molecule and immediate neighbor. They could cross the strait, so to speak, but they couldn't travel down a highway to a distant town, you see. See, this is the whole idea. See, this is what man does. He just doesn't see the truth. In all aspects of where he's here, of all life here on this planet. Organisms were still pictured essentially as bags of water containing very complex solutions of chemicals. The law of chemistry, and this is why Raymond Reich is so important, folks. He could see this alive in a microscope, and that does not happen today yet. And those that say that we have that technology is lying to you. Okay? Raymond Reich invented the microscope that he could actually see live phenomenon as he looked at it. We don't have that technology now because somebody didn't want us to know this or keep us in the dark, and they blackball this guy. You've been lied to all your life about all things on this planet, folks. All of it. Not just disease, but where you came from and what you're doing here. Why you're here. We're not here to work for the man. That is not our reason to be here. Pure and simple. The laws of chemistry had explained a lot about metabolic processes, and electron transport now explains even more. But there were not yet an organizing principle. Elephants grow from tiny embryos, which grow from single brainless cells. Salamanders regenerate perfect limbs. When we are cut or break a bone, cells and organs throughout our body mobilize and coordinate their activities to repair the damage. How does the information travel? How? Barring St. George's water, do protein molecules live? End quote. Despite St. George's sin, that is, his prediction, have proven correct. Molecules and cells do not drift in random to collide with one another. That's strictly asinine, folks. It's asinine. Most are firmly anchored to membranes. The water inside cells is highly structured and does not resemble the free-flowing liquor, not liquid, I should say liquid, that sloshes around in a glass before you drink it. Poison electricity, a property of crystals that makes them useful in electronic products that transform mechanical stress into electrical voltages, and vice versa, has been found in cellulose, collagen, in horn, bone, wool, wood, tendon, blood vessel walls, muscle, nerve, fibrin, DNA, and every type of protein examined. In other words, something most biologists have been denying for 2 centuries, electricity that is essential to biology. St. George was not the first to challenge conventional thinking. It was also Otto Ledman, already in 1908, who noticed the close resemblance between the shapes of known liquid crystals and many biological structures, proposed that the very basis of life was a liquid crystalline state. Liquid crystals, like organisms, had the ability to grow from seeds, to heal wounds, to consume other substance or other crystals, to be poisoned, to form membranes, spheres, rods, filaments, and helical structures to divide, to mate, that is, with one other forms, resulting in offspring that had characteristics of both parents to transform chemical energy into mechanical motion. After St. George's daring Budapest lecture, others pursued his ideas. In 1949, a Dutch researcher, E. Katz, K-A-T-Z, explained how electrons could move through a semiconductor chlorophyll crystal during photosynthesis. In 1955, James Basham, B-A-S-S-H-A-M, and Melvin Calvin, working for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, elaborated on the theory. on this theory, that is, in 1956, William Arnold at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory confirmed experimentally that dry chloroplast particles in green plants that contain chlorophyll have many of the properties of guess what? Semiconductors. In 1959, Daniel Eley, E-L-E-Y, at Nottingham University proved that dry proteins, amino acids, and porphyrins are indeed semiconductors. In 1962, Robert Clayton, also at Oak Ridge, found that photosynthesis tissue in living plants behave like semiconductors. In 1970, Alan Althler at the New England Institute showed that thin films of porphyrin do also. In the 1970s, also biochemist Freeman Cope, C-O-P-E, at the United States Naval Air Development Center in Warminster, Pennsylvania, emphasized the importance of solid-state physics for a true understanding of biology, as did biologist Alan Frey, F-R-E-Y, the most active American researcher into the effects of microwave radiation on the nervous system at that time. Ling Wei, W-E-I, professor of electrical engineering at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, stated boldly that a nerve axon is an electrical transmission line and that its membrane is an ionic transistor. He said that the equivalent circuit can be found in any electronic books today, and that, quote, one can easily derive the nerve behavior from semiconductor physically. I'm sorry, not physically, but physics. When he did so, his equations predicted some of the properties of nerves that were and still are puzzling to physiologists. In 1979, a young professor of bioelectronics at the University of Edinburgh published a book titled Dialectic and Electronic Properties of Biological Materials. The early work of Ele and Arnold have been criticized because the activation energies they have measured, the amount of energy necessary to make proteins conduct electricity, seemed to be too large. Supposedly, there was not enough energy available in living organisms to lift electrons into the into the conduction band. Proteins might be made to conduct electricity in the laboratory, said the critics, but this could not happen in the real world. Ellick and Arnold, however, had done all their work on dry proteins, not living ones. The young professor, Ronald Pethig, P-E-T-H-I-G, pointed out the obvious. Water is essential to life, and proteins become more conductive if you add water to them. In fact, studies have shown that adding only 7.5% water increases the conductivity of many proteins 10,000-fold or more. Water, he proposed, is an electron donor that dopes, D-O-P-E-S, proteins and turns them into good semiconductors. The electronic role of living water has already been noted by others. Physicologist Gilbert Ling, L-I-N-G, realizing that cell water is a gel and not a liquid, developed his theory of the electronic nature of cells in 1962. More recently, Gerald Pollack, P-O-L-L-A-C-K, professor of bioengineering at the University of Washington, has taken up this line of investigation. He was inspired by Ling when they met at a conference in the mid-1980s. Pollock's most recent book, The Fourth Phase of Water, Beyond Solid, Liquid, and Vapor, was published in 2011. The late geonetist Mao Wan Ho, M-A-E-W-A-N, Ho, in London, has clothed St. Georgie ideas in garments that all can see. That is, she developed a technique using polarizing microscope that displayed in vivid color the inference pattern generated by the liquid crystalline structure that make up living creatures. The first animal she put under her microscope was a tiny worm, a fruit fly larva. As it crawls along, it weaves its head from side to side, flashing jaw muscles in blue and orange stripes on a magnetic background, end quote, she wrote in 1993 in her book, The Rainbow and the Worm, The Physics of Organisms. She and many others have urged that the liquid crystalline properties of our cells and tissues not only teach us about our chemistry, but have something special to tell us about our life, about life itself. Was demosine Demison Sedlak, Sedlak, pursuing St. George's ideas in Poland, developed the discipline of bioelectronics within the Catholic University of Lublin, Lublin, during the 1960s. Life, he said, is not only a collection of organic compounds undergoing chemical reactions, but those chemical reactions are coordinated with electron processes that take place in an environment of protein semiconductors. Other scientists working at the same university are continuing to develop this discipline theoretically and experimentally today. Marin Wonk has focused on porphyrins as key to the evolution of life. He states that the principal function of porphyrin systems is an electronic one. Zon, S-Z-O-N, head of the Department of Theoretical Biology in the university, has focused on the electronic properties of biological membranes. Oddly enough, the use of porphyrins in electronic products instructs us about biology. Adding thin films of porphyrins to commercially available photovoltaic cells increase the voltage, current, and total power output. Prototype solar cells based on porphyrins have been produced, as have organic transistors based on porphyrins. The properties that make porphyrins suitable in electronics are the same properties that make us alive. As everyone knows, playing with fire is dangerous. Oxidation releases tremendous energy quickly and violently. How then do living organisms make use of oxygen? How do we manage to breathe and metabolize our food without being destroyed in a conflagration? The secret lies in the highly pigmented fluorescent molecule called porphyrin. Strong pigments are always efficiently energy absorbers, and if they are also fluorescent, they are also good energy transmitters, as St. George taught us in the 1957 book called Bioengineered Genetics. Quote, fluorescent does tell us that the molecule is capable of accepting energy and does not dissipate it. These are two qualities any molecule must have to be able to act as an energy transmitter, end quote. Porphyrins are more efficient energy transmitters than any others of life's components. In technical terms, their ionization potential is low and their electron affinity high. They are therefore capable of transmitting large amount of energy rapidly in small steps, one low energy electron at a time. They can even transmit energy electronically from oxygen to other molecules instead of dissipating that energy as heat and burning up. That's why breathing is possible. On the other side of the great cycle of life, porphyrins in plants absorb the energy of sunlight and transport electrons that change carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and oxygen. You hear that? Hello? Anybody out there thinking? Anybody out there that's got a head that changed carbon dioxide into water into carbohydrates and oxygen? That's right. That's right. That's the truth. You're not being told the truth by the public now, you see, that somehow carbon is a bad object out here. Yeah, no, better not get on that steel than Mike. Porphyrins, the nervous system, and the environment. There's one more place there surprising molecules are found in the nervous system, the organ where electrons flow. In fact, in mammals, the central nervous system is the only organ that shines with the red fluorescent glow of porphyrins when examined under ultraviolet light. These porphyrins, too, perform a function that is basic to life. They occur, however, in a location where one might least expect to find them, not in the neurons themselves, the cells that carry messages from our five senses to our brain, but in the myelin shields that envelope them. The shields, now I may be saying that wrong, so beg pardon about that, whose role has been almost totally neglected by researchers and whose breakdown causes one of the most common and least understood neurological disease of our time called multiple sclerosis. It's orthopedic surgeon Robert O. Becker, B-E-C-K-E-R, who in the 1970s discovered that myelin shields are really electrical transmission lines. And yet we don't go any further than that, it seems, you know. That's the 1970s, folks. Why is this being held? When is this being held? Why is this being kept from the people? Why is this being kept from the public? In a state of health, the myelin shields contain primarily two types of porphyrins, what they call coproporphyrin 3 and protoporphyrin in a ratio of 2:1, complex with zinc. The exact composition is crucial. When environmental chemicals poison the porphyrin pathways, excess porphyrins bound to heavy metals build up in the nervous system, as in the rest of the body. This disrupts the myelin shields and changes their conductivity, which in turn alters the excitability of the nerves they surround. The entire nervous system becomes hyperactive to stimuli of all kinds, including electromagnetic fields. So that's why people have struggles, okay? What was that called? That's called heavy metals, folks. Heavy metals. Dr. Bill McGraw talks about that whole issue of heavy metals and how they affect our body, and they're not positive always. The cells surrounding our nerves were hardly even studied until recently. In the 19th century, autonomous, finding no apparent function for them, supposed that they must have only a, quote, neutral and supportive role, protecting the real, quote, nerves that they surround. This is when you come up with presuppositions, folks. You just come presupposing that something's there. You don't really do the research. You just kind of glide over it. And it takes someone hundreds of years later to come back and say, wait a minute, this does have importance. Why would it be here? That's all you got to ask, simply. Why would it be here? There's got to be a purpose in all things that are put on the body, okay? It has a purpose. Discovery of the actions potentially, which transmit signals along each neuron and of neurotransmitters, the chemicals that carry signals from one neuron to the next, has ended this discussion. From then on, glial, GLIAL cells were thought to be little more than packing material. Most biologists ignore the fact discovered by German physicist Rudolf Virchow, that's Virchow, I should say, Virchow in 1854, that myelin is a liquid crystal. They did not think it was relevant. However, working from the 1960s to the early 1980s, an author in 1985, The Body Electric, Becker found quite another function for the myelin-containing cells and took another step towards restoring electricity to its proper role in the function of living things. When he began his research in 1958, Becker was simply looking for a solution to orthopedics, general unsolved problems, non-union of fractures. Occasionally, despite the best medicine care, a bone would refuse to heal. Surgeons believed that only chemical processes were at work, simply scrapping the fractal surface, devised complicated plates and screws to hold the bone ends rigidly together and hope for the best. Where this did not work, limbs had to be amputated. Quote, these approaches seemed superficial to me, end quote, Becker recalls. Quote, I doubt that we would ever understand the failure to heal unless we totally understood healing itself. So Becker began to pursue the ideas of Albert St. Georgia, thinking that if proteins were semiconductors, maybe bones were too, and maybe electron flow was the secret to the healing of fractures. Ultimately, he proved that this was correct. Bones were not just made of collagen and apatite, as he was taught in medical school. They were also doped with tiny amounts of copper, much as silicon wafers in computers are doped with tiny amounts of boron or aluminum. The presence of greater or lesser amounts of metal atoms regulates the electrical conductivity of the circuit, that is, in bones as in computers. With this understanding, Becker designed machines that deliver minuscule electrical currents as small as one trillionth of an ampere or an amp to fracture bones to stimulate the healing process with great success. These devices were forerunners of machines that are used today by orthopedic surgeons in hospitals throughout the world. Becker's work on the nervous system is less well known. As already mentioned, the functioning of neurons had been worked out up to the point in the 19th century. They transmitted an enormous amount of information to and from the brain at high speed, including data about one's environment, instructions to one muscle. They do this via the familiar action potential and neurotransmitters. And since the action potential is a all or nothing event, neuron signaling is a on off digital system like today's computers. But Becker thought that this could not explain the most important properties of life. There had to be a slower, more primitive, and more sensitive analog system that regulates growth and healing that we inherited from lower forms of life. A system that might be related to the acupuncture meridians of Chinese medicine, which Western medicine also made no attempt to understand. A number of researchers before Becker, among them were Harold Saxton Burr, B-U-R-R at Yale, Lester Barth, B-A-R-T-H at Columbia, Elmer Lund at the University of Texas, Ralph Gerard and Benjamin Lippitt at the University of Chicago, Theodore Buglick, B-U-L-L-O-C-K at UCLA, and William Burge at the University of Illinois had measured DC voltage on the surface of living organisms, both plants and animals and minerals. Most biologists pay no attention, after all, certain DC currents called currents of injury, end quote, were well known, or were thought to be well understood. They had to be discovered by Carlo Mattulli as long as ago in the 1830s. Biologists had assumed for a century that these currents were meaningless artifacts causing, that is, not causing, but caused simply by ions leaking out of wounds. But when in the 1930s and 40s, a growing number of scientists seeing better techniques began to find DC voltage on all surface of all living things, and not just on the surface of wounds, a few began to wonder whether those quote currents of injury, end quote, just might be a bit more important than they had learned in school. The accumulated work of these scientists show that trees, and probably all plants, are polarized electrically, positive to negative from leaves to roots, and that animals are similar polarized from head to feet. In human, potentially difference of up to 150 millivolts or more could sometimes be measured between one part of the body and another. Becker was the first to map the charge distribution in an animal in some detail, accomplishing this with salamanders in 1960. The place of greatest positive voltage, he found, as measured from the back of the animal, were the center of the head, the upper spine over the heart, and the lumbosacral plexus at the lower end of the spine, while the places of greatest negative voltage were the 4 feet and the end of the tail. So that would mean something what we call grounding, wouldn't it? In addition, that's just my speculation, that's not in the book. In addition, the head of an alert animal was polarized from back to front, as though an electric current were always flowing in one direction through the middle of its brain. However, when an animal was anesthesiazed, the voltage diminished as the anesthesia took effect, and then the head reversed polarity when the animal lost consciousness. This suggested to him a novel method of inducing amnesia. And when Becker tried it, it worked like a charm in the salamander, at least passing an electric current of only 30 millionths of an ampere from front to back through the center of his head, caused the animal to become immediately unconscious and unresponsive to pain. When the current was turned off, the animal promptly woke up. He observed the same back-to-front polarity in alert humans and the same reversal during sleep and anesthesia. While Becker did not try it on himself, even tinier electric currents have been used in psychiatric to put humans to sleep since about 1950 in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Asian countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. In these treatments, current is sent from front to back through the midline of the head, reversing the normal polarity of the brain, just as Becker did with his salamanders. The first publication describing this procedure specified short pulses of 10 to 15 microamperes each to 5 to 25 times per second, which gave an average current of only about 30 billionth of an ampere. Although large currents will cause immediate unconscious in a human, just like a salamander, these tiny currents are all that is necessary to put a person to sleep. This technique, called electro sleep, end quote, has been used for over a half a century to treat mental disorders, including manic depressive illnesses and schizophrenia in that part of the world. The normal electrical potentiality or potentials of the body are also necessary for the perception of pain. The abolition of pain is in a person's arm, for example, whether caused by a chemical anesthesia or by hypnosis or acupuncture, is accompanied by a reversal of electrical polarity in that arm. In the 1970s, it became clear to the researchers who were looking into such things that the DC potentialities they were measuring played a key role in organizing living structures. They were necessary for growth and development. They were also needed for regeneration and healing. Tweedy John Todd, spelled Tweedy, John Todd, demonstrated as long ago as 1823 that a salamander cannot regenerate a severed leg if you destroy that leg's nerve supply. So for a century and a half, scientists searched for the chemical signal that must be transmitted by nerve to the trigger to growth. No one ever found one. Finally, the gentleman named, a lady, Sylvia Merle Rose, in the mid-1970s at Tulane University, proposed that maybe there was no such chemical and that the long salt signal was purely electrical. Could the currents of injury, he asked, that had previously been considered mere artifacts themselves played a central role in healing? Rose found that they did. He recorded the pattern of the currents in the wounded stumps of salamanders as they regenerated their severed limbs. Sorry, I said she, I meant to say he. End of the stump, he found was always strongly positive during the first few days after injury, then reversed polarity to become stronger, negative, for the next couple of weeks, finally reestablishing the weekly negative bulge found on all healthy salamander legs. Rose then found that salamanders would regenerate their legs normally, even without a nerve supply, providing he carefully duplicated with an artificial source of current the electrical pattern of healing that he observed. Regeneration would not take place if the polarity, magnitude, or sequence of currents were not correct. Once having established that the signals that trigger regeneration are electrical and not chemical in nature, these scientists were in for yet another surprise for the DC potentialities of the body that, as we have seen, are necessary not just for regeneration, but for growth, healing, pain perception, and even consciousness seem to be generated not in the, quote, real, end quote, nerves, but in the myelin-containing cells that surrounded them, the cells that also contain porphyrins. Proof came by the accident while Becker was again working on the problem of why some bone fractures failed to mend. Since he had already learned that nerves were essential to healing, he tried in the early 1970s to create an animal model for fractures that do not heal by severing the nerve supply to a series of rat legs before breaking them. To his surprise, the leg bones still heal normally, with that is being a 6-day delay. Yet 6 days was not nearly enough time for a rat to regenerate a severed nerve. Could bones be an exception? He wondered to the rule that nerves are needed for healing. That was his question. Then we took a more detailed look at the specimen, wrote Becker. Quote, we found that the Schwann, SCHWANN, cell shields were growing across the gap during the 6-day delay. As soon as the perennial sleeve was mended, the bones began to heal normally, indicating that at least the healing or output signal was being carried by the shield rather than the nerve itself. The cells that biologists had considered merely insulation turned out to be the real wires, end quote. It was the Schwann cells, Becker concluded, the myelin-containing light cells, and not the neurons they surrounded. You all change your books now, you see. The teaching books you take at college or at school. And in a much earlier study, Becker had already shown that the DC currents that flow along salamander legs and presumably along the limbs and bodies of our higher animals are of semiconducting type also, which brings us full circle. The myelin shields, the liquid crystalline sleeves surrounding our nerves, contain semiconducting porphyrins, doped with heavy metal atoms, probably zinc. It was Harvey Solomon and Frank Figge, F-I-G-G-E, who in 1958 first proposed that these porphyrins must play an important role in nerve conduction. The implications of this are especially important for people people with chemical and electromagnetic sensitivities. Those of who genetically have relatively less of one or more porphyrin enzymes may have a, quote, nervous temperament, end quote, because our myelin is doped with slightly more zinc than our neighbors and is more easily distributed by the electromagnetic fields, EMF, around us. But toxic chemicals and EMF are therefore synergistic. Exposure to toxins further disrupts the porphyrin pathways, causing the accumulation of more porphyrins and their precursors, rendering the myelin and the nerves they surround still more sensitive to EMFs. According to most recent research, a large excess of porphyrin precursors can prevent the synthesis of myelin and break apart the myelin shields, leaving the neurons they surround naked and exposed. Now you understand what EMFs can be a problem? The true situation is undoubtedly more complex than this, but to put all the pieces correctly together will require researchers who are willing to step outside our cultural blinders and acknowledge the existence of electrical transmission lines in the nervous system of animals. Already, mainstream science has taken the first step by finally acknowledging that GLIAL, G-L-I-A-L cells are much more than packing material. In fact, a discovery by a team of researchers at the University of Genoa is currently revolutionizing neurology. Their discovery is relating to breathing. Everyone knows that the brain consumes more oxygen than any other organ, and that if a person stops breathing, the brain is the first organ to die. What the Italian team confirmed in 2009 is that as much as 90% of that oxygen is consumed not by the brain's nerve cells, but by the myelin shields that surround them. Traditional wisdom has it that the consumption of oxygen for energy takes place only in tiny bodies inside cells called, I always get this word wrong, mitochondria. I guess that's how you pronounce it, mitochondria. And Dr. Bill McGraw talks about that quite a bit. I don't know if he's read this book. I probably might send him something. That wisdom has now been turned on its head. In the nervous system, at least most of the oxygen appears to be consumed in the multiple layers of fatty substance called myelin, which contains no mitochondria at all, but which 40 years old research shows contains non-HEMF, H-E-M-F, porphyrins, and is semi-conducting. Some scientists are even beginning to say that the myelin shield is, in effect, itself a giant mitochondrion, without which the huge oxygen needs of our brain and nervous system could never be met. But to truly make sense of this collection of facts will also require the recognition that both the neurons, as Ling W-E-I, proposed, and the myelin shields that envelope them, as Robert Becker proposed, work together to form a complex, elegant electrical transmission line system subject to electrical interference, just like transmission lines built by human engineers. The exquisite sensitivity of even by the normal nervous system to electromagnetic fields was proven in 1956 by zoologists Carlo Terrazullo and Theodore Bullock, and then ignored by everyone since. In fact, Terrazullo and Bullock were astonished by the results. Experimenting on crayfish, C-R-A-Y, fish, they found that although a substantial amount of electrical current was needed to cause a previously silent nerve to fire, incredibly tiny currents could cause an already firing nerve to alter its firing rate tremendously. A current of only 36 billionth of an amp was enough to increase or decrease a nerve rate of firing by 5 to 10%, and a current of 150 billionth of an amp, thousands of times less than the widely assumed still today by developers of modern safety codes to have any biological effect whatever, would actually double the rate of firing or silent the nerve altogether, whether it's increased or decreased the activity of this nerve depended on the direction in which the current was applied to the nerve. The zinc connection. The role of zinc was discovered in the 1950s by Henry Peters, a Porphyrins at the University of Wisconsin Medical School. Like Morton, after him, Peters was impressed by the number of people who seemed to have mild or latent porphyrin and thought the trait was far more prevalent than was commonly believed. Peters, that is Henry Peters, discovered that his porphyrin patients who had neurological symptoms were excreting very large amounts of zinc in their urine, up to 36 times normal. In fact, their symptoms correlated better with the levels of zinc in their urine than with the levels of porphyrins they were excreting. With this information, Peters did the most logical thing in scores of patients. He tried to chelation to reduce the body's load of zinc, and it worked. In patients after patient, when courses of treatment with BAL or ETA, EDTA, had reduced the levels of zinc in their urine to normal, their illness resolved, and the patients remained symptom-free for up to several years. Contrary to conventional wisdom, which assumed that zinc deficiency is common and should be supplemented, Peters' patients, because of their genetics and their polluted environment, were actually zinc poisoned, as at least 5 to 10% of the population with hidden porphyrin may also be. For the next 40 years, Peters found tremendous resistance to his idea that zinc toxicity was at all common. But growing evidence is now accumulating that this is so. Large amounts of zinc are in fact entering our environment, our homes, and our bodies from industrial processes, galvanized metals, and even the fillings in our teeth. Zinc is in denture cream and in motor oil. There's so much zinc in automobile tires that their constant erosion makes zinc one of the main components of road dust, which washes in our streams, rivers, and reservoirs, eventually getting back into our drinking water. Wondering whether this was perhaps poisoning us all. A group of scientists from Brookhaven National Laboratory, the United States Geological Survey, and several universities raised rats on water supplemented with a low level of zinc. By 3 months of age, the rats already had memory deficits. By 9 months of age, they had elevated levels of zinc in their brain. In a human experiment, pregnant women in a slum area of Bangladesh were given 30 milligrams of zinc daily in the expectation that they would benefit the mental development and motor skills of their bodies, of their babies. The researchers found just the opposite. In a companion experiment, a group of Bangladesh infants were given 5 milligrams of zinc daily for 5 months with the same surprising result. The supplemented infants scored more poorly or standard tests of mental development. And a growing body of literature showing that zinc supplements worsen Alzheimer's disease and that chelation therapy to reduce zinc improves cognitive functions in Alzheimer's patients, which is what Dr. Bill McGraw talks about. He has a video talking about, I think, Alzheimer's. Okay? He's well worth the time. A man in Panama who's trying to help people. A brilliant man and a brilliant doctor, too. An Australian team who examined autopsy specimens found that Alzheimer's patients had double the amount of zinc in their brains as people without Alzheimer's, and that the more severe the dementia, the higher the zinc levels. Why don't they, people? Why don't they? This is basic, folks. Nutritionists have long been misled by using blood tests to judge the body's store of zinc. Scientists are finding out that blood levels are not reliable, and that unless you are severely malnourished, there is no relation between the amount of zinc in your diet and the level of zinc in your blood. In some neurological diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, it is common to have high levels of zinc in the brain while having normal or low levels of zinc in the blood. In a number of diseases, including diabetes, cancer, urinary zinc is high, while blood zinc is low. It appears that the kidneys respond to the body's total load of zinc and not to the levels in the blood, so that blood levels can become low, not because of zinc deficiency, but because the body is overloaded with zinc and the kidneys are removing it from the blood as fast as it can. It also appears to be much more difficult than we think. It's more difficult than we used to think for people to become deficient by eating a zinc-poor diet. The body is amazingly capable of compensating for even extremely low levels of dietetic zinc by increasing intestinal absorption and decreasing excretion through urine, stool, and skin. While the recommended dietary allowance for adult males is 11 milligrams per day, a man can take as little as 1.4 milligrams of zinc a day and still maintain homeostasis and normal levels of zinc in the blood and tissues. But a person who increases his or her daily intake beyond 20 milligrams may risk toxic effects in the long term. Canaries in the mind. In our cells, the manufacture of heme, H-E-M-E, from porphyrins can be inhibited by a large variety of toxic chemicals, and not so far as we know, that is, by electricity. But we will see in the coming chapters that electromagnetic fields interfere with the most important job that this heme is supposed to do for us, enabling the combustion of our food by oxygen so that we can live and breathe. Like rain on a campfire, electromagnetic fields douse the flames of metabolism. They reduce the activity of the cytochrome, and there is evidence that they do so in the simplest of all possible ways by exerting a force that alters the speed of electrons being transported along the chain of cytochromes to oxygen. Every person on the planet is affected by this invisible rain that penetrates into the fabric of our cells. Everyone has a slower metabolism, is less alive than in those fields were not there. We will see how the slow aspiratia causes the major diseases of civilization called cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. There is no escape, regardless of diet, exercise, lifestyle, and genetics. The risk of developing these diseases is greater for every human being and every animal than it was a century and a half ago. People with a genetic predisposition simply have a greater risk than everyone else because they have a bit less heme in their mitochondria to start with. In France, liver cancer was found to be 36 times as frequent in people carrying a gene for porphyrin as in the general population. In Sweden and Denmark, the rate was 39 times as high, and the lung cancer rate tripled the general rate. Chest pain, heart failure, high blood pressure, and EKGs suggestive of oxygen starvation are well known in porphyrin. Porphyrin patients with normal coronary arteries often die of heart arrhythmias or heart attacks. Glucose tolerance tests and insulin levels are usually abnormal. In one study, 15 of 36 porphyrin patients had diabetes. Wow, that's 40%. The protein manifestation of this disease, capable of affecting almost any organ, are widely blamed on impaired cellular respiration due to a deficiency of heme. Indeed, no porphyrin expert has offered a better explanation. The 5 to 10% of the population who have low porphyrin enzyme levels are the so-called canaries in the coal mine, whose songs of warning, however, have been tragically ignored. They are the people who come down with neurasthenia in the last half of the 19th century when telegraph wires swept the world, the victims of sleeping pills in the late 1880s or barbiturates in the 1920s, and of suffered drugs in the 1930s. The men, women, and children with multiple chemical sensitivity poisoned by the soup of chemicals that have rained on us since World War II. The abandoned souls with electrical sensitivity left behind by the computer age, forced into lonely exile by the inescapable radiation of the wireless revolution. In part 2 of this book, as we will see just how essentially this general population of the world has been affected as a result of the failure to heed their warnings. So that's the end of part 1 of the particular book here. So that was the first 10 chapters. And I'm going to take a break at this point. It's a lot longer chapter than I anticipated. I hope that all of you enjoyed what I'm sharing. It's important that you understand what in the world is going on and why we're so sick. Okay? So thank you for listening. Let's see. Yes, I see your comment. Absalom, yes, at 2:13. That's a few minutes. That was about an hour ago. Never heard of him. Well, reason why I haven't heard of him probably because it's probably has probably no more than 5 or 10,000 copies. I'm assuming throughout the world. But the guy he's done his research. If you want to look into this, you can just simply go to archive.org and it's on there. You can read it. But I'm reading anyway, so you can listen. But anyway, that's chapter 10 this afternoon. Thank you for being here, Absalom. Appreciate your comment. And so hopefully we'll try another chapter a little later here today and go from there. Thank you for being here. Today is the 12th day of September. It is 2024. This book was written probably, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, maybe close to that, maybe not quite that long. But I doubt there's been 10,000 copies, folks. It's really sad. It's very important work. This guy, has done something. So thank you for being here and look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.